Thank you for all those kind words. And just to make sure you didn't mishear, I am no longer at BP. I'm now in the arms of retirement, doing some things privately as well as being engaged on a number of boards and a few consultancies here or there. And of course, the privilege of lockdown in London during winter, not a great time, but it's the nature of the world. And in fact, it's one of the topics that maybe we should spend a little time on today, which is managing ourselves and what we do in this great time of uncertainty. And whether you should be proactive or reactive about that. I'm going to ask Kirsty if she could pop up the slides, and I'll just signal as I go what to do with the slides. I start it was in an odd way a difficult task for me to think about lessons from the boardroom and how I actually speak to them. But I'll just share these thoughts as they have occurred to me. I'm going to try and take you almost on my journey of entering from senior executive management positions into board roles and trying to grapple with some of the issues that I've experienced and seen, and this distinction of what do you do in your role as a board member versus when you used to be involved in management, or when you are involved in management and asked to serve on a board. So that's a number of perspectives. So I'll start, if you can put the first slide up. This is almost, when I went to my orientation, first orientation I ever had around what is my role. I come from legal practice, so I understand the theory and practice of what it is to be a director in a legal sense, where the obligations arise and the descriptions and the case law that has pertained to some of the development of what you see on this slide. But what I discovered was that often it's a sort of a legal listing of the roles without necessarily the detail and challenge of how do you bring that role to life. And classically, this is what you find in a lot of presentations that people will give to you on, I don't think anything is particularly excluded, establishing and reviewing vision, goals, strategy and policy, creating, reviewing the structures and internal controls, monitoring procedures to guide and set the pace. And the classic phrase, governance is about guiding, and it's not about the day-to-day management of the entity. That's the role of management and the purview of management. But one of the greatest difficulties I've seen is, and I have personally experienced, is letting go the role of the manager when you sit in the boardroom and truly becoming into the role of directing, guiding, supporting the management in their role of the day-to-day management and results of the company. Reviewing and evaluating and future threats and opportunities, the issue of the delegation of authorities, quite a thorny issue because in my view, a lot of our regional boards are not that clear about what authority has been delegated. And the theory certainly is that the company has all the authority, the directors then take that authority and roll it down. And in my view, I've been surprised actually at how much authority is still retained by boards and how much of a clog on important discussions that becomes, because how often the CEO and his management team have to come back to the board for approvals or to have things approved, which you would expect that if we've had a competent CEO and management, they should be able to decide. And so that's a big issue, and I think it's particularly so in state companies, and it's particularly so as well in family companies. Not that the state has a unique hold on that particular issue. Understanding and considering the accountable interests of shareholders and relevant shareholders, and that's particularly one I found difficult in state boards, where the government is the shareholder or sees itself as the shareholder. Actually, that's not quite the law. There's a corporation sole who is a caretaker literally for the population at large. But this issue of whose interests are you there for when you serve as a director? Are you just there to serve the government's interests or the interest of the entity? And that distinction is a very, very difficult one for a lot of people in politics to understand. Your role vis-a-vis the company, your fiduciary duty to the company and not to the shareholder. That you are there to be accountable for the interests of the shareholder, but that's not where your fiduciary duty lies. And of course, promoting goodwill and communicating, particularly in this age where transparency has become such an important issue in the world, where there's such a little or a lack of trust in established institutional frameworks virtually across the world. This is something that's sweeping the world and creating a lot of anxiety and difficulty for directors. I could tell you that I expect that this will increase over time in our region. And that is when I speak about that, I mean the Caribbean. But I could tell you, as management in the developed world, like in the UK, when I went to a BP AGM meeting, we were on tenterhooks because shareholders were quite virulent. The role of the activist shareholder and the challenge from the activist shareholder was quite a concern. That still is quite, in my experience, quite a docile area, which I think actually puts quite an onerous accountability on directors in the region, because the shareholders are not yet, in my view, in my respectful view, they are not yet as discerning as I think they will become. Can we have the next slide? And this slide would speak to the responsibilities of directors. This classic again looks after the affairs of the company. Directors must act with due skill and care, prevent abuse of position, exercise powers with proper purpose, act in good faith, ensure the proper books of accounts, and consider the interests of the employees of the companies. This is my first and most important point, and it's in my next slide, where I ask the question, but is this enough? And in my humble view, that's not enough. That kind of description basically is a very narrow, legalistic sense of what the role and obligation and liabilities of a director in the modern era are. I think what we are finding is that the more effective boards are searching for a balance between sort of what I call the fiduciary agenda of the board and what I would call the more strategic, forward-looking agenda of the board. And that's because we're living in a world where environmental issues have finally rung the bell, and we're in a race against time on environmental issues. Technological and business model changes are happening so quickly that you find yourself becoming quite dated quite quickly about business models, technological disruptions, and change. Demographic shifts and priorities. I mean, people are no longer tolerant. They shift quickly away from companies and entities. They hold them to account in a very deep and radical ways. And that's causing a massive reshaping of the business environment. And we haven't yet talked about the realization that some of those high impact, but very unlikely to occur events are now starting to occur with virulent weather and pandemics as we've never seen them before. So in that environment of great uncertainty, it is my contention that you can't just be sort of backward looking at the fiduciary relationship and sort of performance reviews and compliance reviews, but really trying to get ahead by becoming far more strategic and spending much more time in looking at what's coming as opposed to what's already happened. Governance suffers when boards spend too much time looking in the rearview mirror. And honestly, Nigel, it's a very, very good point you raised. If a board just simply steps into the role of management, what it tends to find itself doing is spending all its time in the present or in the past. And it is my contention that when boards in the modern era are finding their sweet spot is when they begin to look forward and engage the management and pull the management from the day-to-day in periodic looks at the future. The pace of change and uncertainty requires, therefore, getting in front of challenges, not reacting to them. And honestly, my experience is we are being too reactive, about things that are coming. I was expressing this to Kamla in preparation for this session, that one of the challenges I'm finding is when I sit here in the UK, it's like pandemic and what's coming after the pandemic, all of the changes in where people will work, what they are looking at, you're already seeing them blooming. But you go to the board in the Caribbean and it's still as though nothing has happened. And I think that's just a reflection of mine, is that we are just in a more reactive mode and not forward looking enough. We are still hanging on to what we have rather than trying to look forward and anticipate what might be coming. And there is a lot of data now. My good friends at McKinsey, a consulting firm that, because I worked at BP, we spend a lot of time with, they are definitely doing work that suggests that when boards go beyond the sort of traditional oversight responsibility to a deeper involvement in strategy, risk, digitization, and by that I mean the disruptive approaches that this era of the Internet of Things is bringing to businesses, and then other disruptors. When I sat as an executive with the BP board, we would spend 3 or 4 days a year just looking at, what batteries, for example, and the development of that technology was going to do to overtake the energy industry as we know it. And we're beginning to see and feel those companies reacting to those disruptors. It's therefore my theory that a more dynamic agenda is required. And certainly the boards that I sit on in Trinidad, both of them are in a very dynamic search for the right kind of agenda and where to spend the right amount of time and the commitment to a more dynamic, forward-looking agenda. Next slide, please. I've pulled together 2 things here, and in fact, one of them, I'm actively looking at as we think about agendas. And the first thing I would tell you is that my experience now is that we went through a sort of approach where boards met less in order to get out of the management here and allow the management to day-to-day managing room and width to guide and drive the company, and focused a lot on what happened in the meeting last and the a more deliberate approach to matters arising, performance reports and metrics and performance, a focus on the quality of the annual general meeting and how you provide for that, the annual accounts, and I distinguish accounts from management information. A lot of boards, in my view, look at accounts but they spend too little time actually looking at management information. And I distinguish them because you have to do a lot of calculations behind a set of accounts in order to really understand the underlying performance of an entity. And you have to be quite an expert, whereas management accounts, management information can quickly help you through that. Reviews by auditors, and then of course the legal, regulatory compliance, and I would call it risk in that sense. And what I am finding is more and more boards are becoming interested. And there's a tendency for some boards to say, well, I want to get more involved. I'm more concerned that I'm not getting, I'm not really understanding what's going on. And we are initially spending more and more time in what I call the management domain, the day-to-day. But I am suggesting that my lesson is we need to start reimagining the agendas and what time is spent on. And in fact, I believe boards need to start owning their agendas, deciding what set of items, where they will spend their time and what they will do with that time. And spending less time or less weight on core fiduciary and oversight duties, even though they remain important, and becoming more dynamic and spending more time on strategy, market and competitive landscape, investment, talent quality in particular, and risk management. And I'll say a little bit more on talent. Dynamic means not usurping management day-to-day responsibility. And I think a lot of board members make that mistake. In the desire to know, we get into the management space and not into the director space. And true governance, which is about setting the forward, seeing the forward agenda, setting the policy that will make it work, and then moving forward. Quality decision making. Often I sit on a board and we have a discussion, and one of the nitpickers have to say, well, what decision was there? Often a lot of chatter, but not decision making, and a lot of information. It's one of my great scares, which is, when you've got to read 1,500 pages of information for a board meeting that will last 4 hours, I think something is wrong with that. I think it's likely to take you into all kinds of rat holes without actually distilling the right information. At the BP board, if I dared go 5 pages, that was considered long in trying to describe globally what we were doing to improve the safety culture and performance of BP post-Macondo. Something that was of great interest to the board. So much interest that the chairman of the safety committee used to come to my office 3 days a week. Not that I liked it, but that's what he used to do because we had lost trust of the board. Board assessment, individual and as a team, education and development, and I don't think I have a specific slide on this, but I really believe a lot of the boards are beginning to do things like, surveys and assessments. But honestly, my experience is until you start having the feedback sessions and the honest deliberations, and there is some real effort to say, here is your improvement and development plan, as you would do with an employee. I think you're still, it is a difficult thing. I mean, removing a board member who is not performing is very difficult. It's why over time I'm starting to believe that it's not that important, the age limit, but I think a term limit for a director is becoming more important to me, because certainly it eases you having someone that stays on and on and on and is yet not performing. But this issue of board members performing and preparing and doing a good job is a quite difficult issue, and one that is often ducked and dodged at boards. And then so spending some time not on the business of the day, the business of the company per se, but really seen it as an important thing to spend time on board reinvention. How is the board working? How is its processes working? Too little time, very little time, aside time, maybe an hour or two in a session of site for 2 days on strategy, you might find that being done. But I think that should be a very proactive part of the board's work, and not an aside. That's my experience. So agenda, getting an agenda that you are satisfied is bringing with the frequency and with the time on to the board is a very important one. And this works, by the way, for you who are maybe not on boards or are just in management or middle management. This technique works everywhere. If you allow things to just come to you when they happen out of the ether, then you don't control the direction of the entity or the people who work for you. A dynamic agenda, being clear about what comes first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and how much time you're going to spend on it, is an absolutely critical management technique for success. Next slide, please. I think board effectiveness is therefore key. You know, this is another way that I think of looking at the way a board really is effective. It's not easy to measure board effectiveness, but I can tell you these 3 areas. You know, all of the big entities that are speaking to boards are speaking about this as it's effective. If a board is effective, we know that company performance is better, and we know that the quality of governance is better. We also know that you know, that more time needs to be spent on this and its processes. Too little time is spent on this by the board. It's almost as though it expects it to happen. Board talent and expertise derives from long-term attention. You can't sort of work on your next board member or your replacement when the replacement is due. And it starts with a very clear vision of where that board has to be, what kind of skills, what kind of culture, where it needs to go, and you need to be deliberate about it. And diversity and gender diversity, and I will come back to that first slide, doesn't happen by chance. And I've learned that in my experience at BPTT and now in boards. If you leave that to chance and to you know, last just-in-time approaches, you don't shift that dial. In fact, you stall. And I am absolutely certain it works in management, it works in entities. Diversity is a key enabler to delivering better results and performance. I'm just moving along, trying to keep time. I wanted to discuss now 3 or 4 particular things. I would call them almost fireside type chats. I think they are particularly important in your role, any role, but particularly in boards. I see this great difficulty of almost a kind of a silent frustration. I know I feel it sometimes, and I know other board members do, who sort of serve on really good, strong boards. You know, good boards and executive teams recognize that while their interests are not identical, they are strongly aligned. There is a different role for the management than the board, but they are a team and they have to work together and align. And it's one of the greatest difficulties in the dynamics of boards. Boards struggle with providing this kind of tension. Often it gets quite acrimonious because I think the challenge, the problem, the issue, rather than the individuals and the messengers, is a critical way to create constructive challenge that creates a result and not just creates destruction of dynamics. You know, boards, in my experience, boards that aggressively challenge executives treat management information like homework that needs check-in or play gotcha to catch up people out, can cause irreparable damage. Inevitably, management becomes guarded and less communicative with the board. And that's the exact opposite of what you want. I suggest, and I try to practice this, not always successfully, that there's nothing like the power of inquiry, not the power of opinion. Leading with an opinion is a dangerous practice, particularly when you have extremely influential positions like board positions. But at the same time, it's not a loosey-goosey affair. You're really asking the management, when you put a constructive challenge to them, to break an issue down, to show they're working, to tell you how they got that result, and to be very clear when you believe something either is missing or thought of or an alternative. And work not to dismiss the perspective of directors with left field views. I'm on a board now where we had a director, he was always the last director to get comfortable with an issue. And he was always the director to ask for another piece of detail. And I could tell you 2 months into the director not being on the board, having retired, we are missing that director. We did not realize the important role that they played in keeping us all alert and on the board, as much as sometimes it created a great deal of frustration. Next slide, please. This is my proud granddaughter, first granddaughter, Sophie Louisa, and you can see her there with a stethoscope working off on Grandpa. And I wanted to talk about gender diversity because I think in my experience that I have something to bring there. I think if you look across the world, I think a lot of women are being encouraged to say that we've made a lot of improvement. And yes, there have been improvements. But if you look at where we have to go to really have gender equality, we have a long way to go, and we do not have the time to waste getting there. I think a lot of us believe we see, a small percentage on each board, and a lot of rationalizing, explaining away why we can't get any more. And in my view, this has worked for me in management, and we are trying to make sure it works in the board level as well. I think if you're really going to have gender equality, a great place for it to really be in practice is at the board, because that leads by example. But it requires a change mindset, because it's something that you have to work on all the time. And it requires new principles for decision making. For example, I believe it's dangerous if an all-man panel is trying to recruit a new set of directors in the current world. Because I come from the school of thought that says, in my experience, I believe there's a pecking order. It's white men, then black men, then white women, then black women. And I believe if we have to change that, and we must, because I think there's so much benefit and richness to changing that, then things like having women on panels that select new directors becomes critical. Expanding the criteria for looking beyond usual pools. Because, the usual saying is, well, the pool, we look at pools like former CEOs and former senior managers, and we also know that that pool tends to be short of women. So guess what? You're going to be short of women to come on a board if you take that view. And I think right expertise and instead of prior experience. This is one of the things I encountered at BP. The first thing people used to tell me why you couldn't promote a national was that they didn't have all the experience, prior experience. But a lot of us had the right expertise, just waiting to get some experience and support. And the same is the case in most instances with women. A lot of times we are making decisions to favor men on the basis that women just don't have the experience, but we are there to get it. So we have to find ways to expand the criteria and bring them into the experience as opposed to them coming with prior experience. Expanding our networks and sources as well as building long-term relationships. We often have to look long before we need and build relationships and networks that would allow us to bring women into the boardroom. And then there's a little typo there, longer succession planning, not just in time. If you want that next board position filled this year and you haven't been looking at women, it's very unlikely that you will find in time to fill that position. And that can become quite an unfulfilling prophecy if you don't do it. So it's better to have a pool and think long. We all know when directors are coming up for either retirement or change, and therefore building a cycle that has a longer wavelength will enable this. That's my experience. Next slide. Boards and strategy. A lot of away days are now being spent by boards 2 days on a strategy. And at the end of it, there's a lot of grumbling, quite honestly. Often because, this is a zone where there's no clear right answer and there's often incomplete data. If you're really doing strategy and you're forward looking, you're going to run into this problem, no clear right answer and incomplete data. And there's something about our education system that encourages us to figure out there has to be a right answer. Sometimes they're just good alternatives. And the real test is, where does your instinct lead you in terms of which one to choose? I also have come across that many directors say they don't understand strategy in response to surveys, where there have been two strategy sessions. Why is that? I believe there are probably 3 good reasons. One is often the strategy presentations that we get are baked and they are the declared strategy of the management. And I believe that is a problem because often directors come with experience, which I think can add to and look for a great value, but it's not achieved because we are trying to be the experts that we are not. If you sit on a bank board, you may have had a lot of very pertinent experiences, but you're not a banking expert. So there's a need to spend time in the deep dynamics and drivers of the industry's economics and what are the drivers of return of the business. And often in those strategy sessions, you've leapt into strategic choices and options long before directors understand and spend enough time in the dynamics. Before options are created, a detailed review of competitors, key external trends, a view of specific capabilities of the company are often important before options are created. And long before strategy is poured, the directors should spend some time with the managers, testing options and looking at alternatives and bringing forward external perspectives before the strategy is baked. In my experience, if more of that was done, I think there'd be less of the allegation of directors are playing in management's zone. There would be a lot more value brought from the experience, wide experience, instinct and judgment, and knowledge of venerable directors. And I think you would have a much better strategic set of outcomes. My final slide, I'm not sure how I'm going on time. Kamala, how am I doing?
You're going very well. We have quite a bit of time.
Okay. I wanted to fire off as my last salvo what I call a few random fireside anecdotes. And the first one is about term limits of directors and extensions. Um, I've seen it directly and I've seen it indirectly that sometimes there's a good reason. I think, even in my own management experience, I think in the Caribbean, people tend to stay in positions too long, way beyond, natural human value. And we give ourselves lots of excuses that we can't find another individual, and a lot of that has to do with, um, failure to plan, failure to execute plans, and a sense of holding on. And I think it is a very important thing wherever you are to think deeply about how long you should be there and whether you are still adding value or not just whether you are in a position. So I think this is a very, very thorny issue in boards in my experience. And often, the contribution of a director 9, 10 years is all destroyed in that next third term or fourth term or fifth term when they are beyond their time and they are starting to limit the conversations rather than extend the conversations. So in my experience, limiting time and people leaving when they should becomes a very important experience. And it's not something that we like. And you would be surprised how many of our senior people are still in positions late in their 70s and 80s, long after they should leave, hanging on and rotating themselves and keeping down opportunities, not just for people, but opportunities for the entities that they are part of. And I really encourage all of us to think hard about when is it time to leave? When is it time to let go and let a next set take what you may have been a deep part of building, extend it beyond that, and not sort of have to be walked out the door. The second one is there's a board that I'm on, and I think it really is the passion of the board and the passion of the management to spend time, precious time, lengthy time in looking at the 30 or 40 top executives of that entity, looking at the development of their talent, discussing how they are performing, looking at what their next opportunity should be and how that talent would grow. There is nothing more rewarding than seeing individuals grow and fulfill their potential, and the taking of time. And that is infectious. It's both to you. I'll tell you this. I haven't met a senior exec that I worked with at BP, and I worked with quite a few over a long period of time, who talk about what they built, which platform and which entity they built. They always talk about the people that they spend time supporting and developing and watching them grow and take over and become the next generation. And it is something that wherever you are, on a board, a senior management position, a middle management position, the joy of talent development and management and the critical nature of having strong talent cannot be avoided. And I encourage you to participate, take it in effort in it. It's how you give back, and it's in fact how your legacy lives. It's not by extending your time at the board or in some management position. It's by really growing talent that supersedes you. That's how your legacy lives on. And then the third one is this idea of listening for weak signals and the quietest voice. Being willing, even when you think you have a strong opinion, and you see, you hear someone really uncomfortable. Often it's not something that you hear, it's something that you see, something that you pick up in the body language. And I don't know, today's world, very difficult online. But our opening up the discussion to a larger question, asking, bringing the person in, inviting them in when there's something that they are saying that really challenges the notion that you have, being open to that challenge. There is nothing more rewarding. I could tell you some of my greatest mistakes, I made quite a few, have come from not listening. You know, I happen to have the privilege of building one of the most expensive oil pipelines in Trinidad. And that had a lot to do with not listening, but pushing and pushing and pushing to make something happen, but not listening for those weak signals. BP's Macondo incident was about not listening for weak signals. There are, a lot of boards today where people are not listening for weak signals, particularly in this time of challenge. Then my fourth random fireside anecdote is about being authentic, being true to yourself, reliable and consistent in the moment. And that ties to maybe point number 6, without trust, nothing can happen, and trust is earned. I would say that one of the greatest weaknesses of leaders, I would call it a vice of leaders, of directors, of people who are accomplished, is at some point they lose this ability to be authentic to themselves. Being true to yourself, being open to contribution from others, being congruent. What I mean by that is what you say is what you do, is what you walk, is what action you take. It's not like you say something and it's for them and it's not for you. There is nothing that destroys authority. There is nothing that destroys your reliability, like not being authentic. And then finally, in my experience, you can learn from anyone, anytime. So you have to listen. No matter how accomplished you are and how long you've thought about something. One of the chairmen that I work with is one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the Caribbean. I am always amazed at how he can, his mind, he can be opened up again and listen, how he listens and takes on board comments from almost anyone in the calmest of ways, even when it takes additional time. Being open to challenge is part of this, the notion that you do not know everything. And that's become even more important in today's world, where you cannot know everything. But learning from anyone, anytime. So listen up. And I'll leave it there. I'm always better when questions are asked. So I just wanted to put those thoughts into the room. And I hand over to you, Kamala.